wireless mic. Yeah.
Okay. It's a workshop?
Yeah. Datamani, got it.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming this evening to this workshop. We're going to get started. Want to thank everyone for coming. I'm Mayor Grafstein. We've got Councilwoman Clark sitting at the back, and we have Police Chief Haynes up here as well as several members of our Crime Commission. I just want to take a second to recognize them. We have former Police Chief Tony Roberts, we have Lisa Sanoa Leonard, we have Jeffrey Hilliard, we have Peg Marentet, and we have Martha Covert. So thank you to the Crime Commission who did come out today. I want to thank Sunita Dadamani for coming this evening to talk to us about recognizing hate crimes. Ms. Dadamani, please.
Thank you. So I was told I'm mic'd up. Can anyone hear me? You can? No? Not from the mic. Oh, it is? Oh, great. Fantastic. I have a very loud, annoying voice anyways, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me in the back regardless. So my name's Sunita Dadamani. I'm the head of the Hate Crimes Unit at the Attorney General's Office in the state of Michigan. And so we formed this unit in around the beginning of 2019 to dedicate specific resources across the state to hate crimes. And so I'm kind of going to go over what exactly a hate crime is, kind of tell you about what's happening in Michigan, show you the trends, and tell you about what people's rights are if they are a victim of a hate crime. And so at the end, I'll have a time for questions. And there's always a lot of questions at the end of this presentation, generally, when I give it. So we have to talk first very generally about what is a hate crime. And a hate crime is any crime where a victim is targeted because of their race, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, or their disability. And so hate crime is a category of crime. It's really any crime where a victim is targeted for any one of these reasons, in whole or in part. And so the question inevitably becomes, what if the person committing the crime is wrong? What if they're wrong about the category that the victim fits into, the identity of the victim? For instance, we've seen this in COVID-related hate crimes throughout the pandemic, where someone who is Korean is targeted for a crime because someone thinks that the perpetrator thinks that they are Chinese, right? And they blame them for COVID. And so even if the person committing the crime is wrong about the victim's identity, that is still a hate crime in the state of Michigan. Also, the next question that comes up, what if race and ethnicity is only one of the reasons the victim is targeted? So we see this sometimes in things like robberies, where a victim is picked out because of their identity. If they're an undocumented immigrant, for instance, a perpetrator might rob that person because they know that undocumented immigrant isn't going to report to police. And so one of the reasons that they are picking this person is because of their identity. And that is still a hate crime. So, excuse me. So self-conscious about coughing in public now. It's, right? So we see this too when you have, so the primary motivation of the person is to rob a person, right? And get their wallet, their keys, their car. But one of the reasons that they're picking them is because of their identity. And that qualifies as a hate crime as well. So, you know, when we think about hate crimes, we think about these larger events, these mass shootings, for instance, right? The Tree of Life Synagogue in Pennsylvania years ago, El Paso, Texas, where Hispanic people were targeted. But what we find is that hate crimes are not just those large shooting sprees, they're more everyday things. So like this graffiti that's clearly race motivated, right? Or the man that leaves threatening voicemails at a mostly black church, or a Portland woman that's accused of snatching a hijab off of somebody's head. These are your more common everyday things that are happening across the country. And these are hate crimes as well, not just those large shooting spree type situations. And so when we talk about hate crimes, we have to think of them as a category, like I mentioned before, and that includes sort of any crime that's motivated. So you have things like ethnic intimidation, where it's a physical act or a damage to property or a threat to do either of those things. And that's the primary Michigan law that applies to hate crimes. But there's also other things if they're motivated by bias. And that's like bias-motivated robbery, like the examples I gave you before. or bias-motivated stalking, or bias-motivated bomb threats, for instance, or bias-motivated cyberbullying. So all of these things fit under the category of hate crime, even if there's no specific statute that is available in the state of Michigan, right? So, and so people often ask, what's the difference between hate crimes and any other crime? Isn't an assault an assault? I mean, no matter what motivates you to do it, isn't it the same? And the answer to that is no, not really. And the reason is because they are messaging crimes. They have a greater psychological impact on more than just an individual. They make an entire community feel isolated, and an entire community can withdraw because of the crime. So you see this now in things like, again, I'll bring up the COVID-related hate crimes, where anybody of Asian descent, when this stuff is happening at the beginning of the pandemic, anyone of Asian descent was scared to leave their home. Even though these things were happening mostly in New York, in California, in Texas, you were hearing about it across the country. And here in Michigan, we have a large Asian American community, and I can tell you that there was definite fear. There was fear in the community that if they left their house, they would be targeted. And so it's got this broader impact. It's not just an individual crime. They're messaging crimes to an entire community. They can also be more severe. Because they can be more brutal, because they can be fueled sort of crimes of passion. And I'll give you an example of this. So if you come outside and you see your car and it's got this etched into it, right? It's like, you come outside, it's been parked in your driveway all night, you come out and you go, oh God, I gotta take this car in, gotta make an insurance claim, these kids in the neighborhood, they're so terrible, I can't stand this, It's different if you walk out and you have symbols like these that are etched on your car, right? Because what are you thinking of with a swastika or a KKK symbol etched into your car? You're thinking about different things. You're thinking about, oh my God, is my family safe? Should I be moving from this house? Is this gonna get increasingly worse? Is this my neighbors that are doing this to me to give me a message, right? And so when one person hears about it, of that community, it has a broader impact. It didn't happen to them. It happened to someone, whether they're Jewish or whether they're black. It happened to that person, but it's got a much broader impact on the entire community. So that's the difference. If you can understand the differences between the picture on the left and the pictures on the right, then you understand that hate crimes are a message to a whole community. And so the bigger picture here is that these smaller everyday events, I don't want to say smaller, they're not insignificant, I don't mean it in that way, but these sort of things that are not mass shootings, these are indicators for things that can become mass shootings. And so that's what we're trying to prevent by dedicating specific resources to these kinds of crimes throughout the state. Racially and ethnically motivated extremist ideologies. They're linked to a large number of mass shootings in the last decade, and there are several examples here. And it is, it outweighs any sort of a random shooting that occurs in the last decade is racially and ethnically motivated, violent extremist ideologies. And so just a disclaimer here, free speech is a sort of different thing. And non-threatening hate conduct, meaning hate speech, is constitutionally protected by the First Amendment. And so, whether it's organizing a gathering to promote hate, so a KKK rally, for instance, constitutionally protected speech, circulating offensive materials like handing out flyers, or saying horrible things, posting bigoted views online, none of this stuff is criminal activity because people can be hateful and people can be jerks, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a crime. So we have to suss out what's free speech and what's hate speech versus hate crimes. So what our mission at the AG's unit, at the AG's office, and I'll just tell you a little bit about what we're doing, is that we investigate and prosecute the hate crimes. We work with local law enforcement to provide resources when necessary. We educate trained communities, kind of like we're doing right now. We educate law enforcement on how to identify and deal with victims from marginalized communities. We educate prosecutors on how to charge appropriately and what best defenses are and what, not best defenses, how to overcome defenses and things of that nature. So that's what we try to do, and we hope that that's helpful, and that we're tackling the problem in some way. So, data. This is what we're seeing is in the last several years, hate crimes have risen. And so this is from 2015 to 2019, which maybe many of you are like, lady, it's 2021. What are you doing with 2019 statistics? Well, the latest statistics from the FBI and state police, Michigan State Police, are only up to 2019 because they gather statistics from local police departments and then they assess them and make sure that they're correct and do sort of a quality control, and then they issue a report almost a full year after that year. So this year's statistics for 2020 will be released in November 2021. That's usually when they do them. And the FBI is the same way. They gather the statistics for a year, they assess them, and then they issue a report once a year. So this is up to 2019, and their cutoff date is usually March. So it's March of 2019. This is the data that we're showing. And the bias motivation. So how much of hate crimes that are occurring in those documented statistics are related to certain identity groups? And so you'll see in Michigan at least, and this is from Michigan State Police's crime report that's available online, and you can take a look at it, but about 3/4 in the last year was race motivated. 12% was religion, sexual orientation came just behind that at 10%, and then a small bit of gender and disability. Now, word about this, the Michigan State Police, again, is required by law in Michigan. We are one of the most advanced states about this. And in Michigan, Michigan State Police has to keep these statistics, and they have a Michigan Incident Crime Reporting section in their Criminal Justice Bureau where they gather these stats and they publish them. This is the nationwide statistics. So Michigan statistics track roughly with the nationwide statistics. These are compiled by FBI. And again, it's all local jurisdictions, and they report up their numbers. And so it roughly tracks with what we see in Michigan. And this is a little more detailed map. It's a little hard to see, but essentially incidents that were 10 or more of hate crimes are in red, those counties, and incidents of 5 or more are in blue. So you can kind of see where we're at. And obviously it's going to be probably obvious, it's the population centers, right, where there's more diversity. So I tell everybody disregard all the statistics I just showed you. I just spent like 10 minutes showing you a bunch of statistics. Why do I say disregard them? Because only a small percentage of hate crimes are actually reported. And that seems sort of counterintuitive. Like, why would someone experience a crime and then not reach out to police to report that crime? And there's a ton of reasons, and we'll go over that in a minute. But how do we know? How do we know that there's only a percentage that gets reported if they're not getting reported, right? Like, how do we know that number? Well, FBI gives us that number because they send out a national crime victimization survey all over the country every year. And there is roughly, they report out 7,000 to 8,000 hate crimes. But when they get their crime victim rights survey back, they gather about 250,000 incidents all over the nation. So there is only a very small percentage that is getting reported in most states. And some states don't even have a requirement to track those numbers and have to report. And so there was recently some legislation that was passed at the federal level that gave incentives to states to start reporting. Because if you don't know the statistics and you don't know the data, then how do you assess the problem? It's really hard to assess the problem without any numbers, hard and fast numbers. So why don't people report? There's a ton of barriers to reporting, and the first is basically mistrust between law enforcement and the community that's experiencing these crimes. There's undocumented people that fear deportation. There's the trans and LGBTQ community that have historically strained interactions with law enforcement. There is a fear of law enforcement in certain communities. There is victims that sometimes feel they aren't taken seriously. These are actual quotes from law enforcement that I have heard. Oh yeah, this isn't a big deal, it's just kids. This is not a problem in my community. I don't want to make a big deal out of this because it'll hurt how our community looks. And this is just the media blowing it out of proportion. And so if victims are reporting and they're crossing that first hurdle of actually letting law enforcement know that they have been the victim of a crime, and then they're faced with something like this, and I know this is not happening here. Chief Haynes has been incredible. But if this is the hurdle that they face, that law enforcement isn't even taking them seriously, that just brings your reporting down even further and lower. And then there's also language barriers, right, that make it very difficult for people to convey exactly what happened, or cultural barriers, like in your home country, going to the police is not a good idea because you have to bribe them to get anything done. You know, there's different impacts from all these different communities on whether they're going to report or not. And so there's a ton of issues with reporting, and so that leads to inaccurate data collection. So we talked a little about the difference between hate crimes and hate speech. I want to make sure I'm on track with time. Yep. And so I had mentioned before, hate-filled speech, it isn't a crime. It's protected by your First Amendment right to say whatever you want. But there is some speech that does rise to the level of a crime. Like, for instance, when we have words with actions, like things like stalking can be obviously speech, but you're acting on it. Cyberbullying, bomb threats is a crime. Lying to police is a crime. Ethnic intimidation is threats to do property damage or physical contact. You have false report of a felony, making terroristic threats. These are all speech-related crimes. These are things that rise to the level of a crime and do not fall within your First Amendment protected speech. So prosecuting hate crimes and issues with successful prosecution. So here's the issues. The problem is this, is that victims aren't reporting, right? And so we discussed all of those reasons why. When they do report, they have the second hurdle. They're sort of misidentified sometimes by law enforcement, right? They're misclassified by the first responders. And then the third hurdle is misidentification by prosecutors. And I say this not to bag on anybody. I'm a prosecutor myself. So it's not like I'm saying people just don't know what they're doing. It's that these are very easy to misclassify because, again, if your primary motivation is something else, and you don't see that little detail where it's like, I targeted this person for this particular reason, then they're easy to misclassify. So when you have prosecutors that are misidentifying it, they're charging the wrong thing. They're not necessarily charging what should be charged. And so they're charged as other crimes. Like I said, an assault is an assault. It's not always just an assault is an assault, you know? And then once they're charged, and there's issues with prosecution because it requires proper follow-through. You're dealing with marginalized communities, and I say no vertical prosecution here. And vertical prosecution is this, is that from the time you are a victim of a crime and the case is charged at a prosecutor's office, you might be shuffled from prosecutor to prosecutor at different stages of the prosecution. So your initial first appearance in court where you have to testify might be one prosecutor, then it goes up to a circuit court, and then it's a different prosecutor. At sentencing, it's a different prosecutor. And so you've got these victims from marginalized communities that have had a hard time even just coming forward to talk about these things. And then you've got them shuffled from prosecutor to prosecutor. And so what we found is that having vertical prosecution helps keep victims aware and on track with what's going on in the prosecution. So if you're seeing the same prosecutor over and over and they've been with you from the beginning, you're going to build trust and there's understanding. And oftentimes if you're getting shuffled from person to person to person in your case, that person might not necessarily be culturally competent, right? They might not know the terms to use to address you in the way that you need to be addressed to feel respected. And so having someone that is vertically prosecuting seems to be helpful to keep these cases alive and deal with less issues during the prosecution. So how do we fix these problems? And I've talked about this kind of already. First is community outreach and building trust. Misidentifying law enforcement. We train police officers, we train prosecutors, and we try to get vertical prosecution and make people culturally competent, so correct terminology. And so these are the different ways, and that's a lot of things going on, right? There's like 4 main hurdles, and if you can get past the 3 or 4 main hurdles, then you may have a successful prosecution. So these are very, very difficult cases to prosecute. Here is the law in the state of Michigan. This is the Michigan Ethnic Intimidation Act. So this was passed in the 80s. If anyone has heard of Vincent Chin, an Asian American man who was working at I believe it was a GM plant. I think it was GM. And he was working at a GM plant building cars, and his fellow GM plant employees were out at a bar where they saw him one night, and they were very angry that back in the 80s, Japan was making cars more efficiently and selling cars and encroaching on the American market. And so they took him out back and they murdered him. And they murdered him because they believed he was the reason that people were losing their jobs at the plant. And so our state legislature decided to pass the Ethnic Intimidation Act. And it's pretty limited, but what it's meant to do is to take things that are lower level crimes, misdemeanors, and elevate them to felonies because of the added component of being victimized. The person is victimized because of their identity. So it's a limited statute, but it's basically physical contact, that's like assault, right? Damage to property, or communicating a believable threat to do either one of those things if they think that that's gonna occur. So what that means is if I shove you because of your identity, then that's the physical contact. Damage to property, or a threat to do either one of those things. And because of that person's, and so you'll see, this is written in the 80s, race, color, religion, gender, or national origin. Does anyone see what's missing, what's missing from this statute? What category is missing? Sexuality, sexual orientation, right? Sexual orientation and gender identity is not included in the statute. So I just had one of these where someone was assaulted because of their LGBTQ status, and this is not the statute. You would think, right? Okay, so it's interesting you say that because in Wayne County there was an assault where the person was victimized because of their sexual orientation, and the Court of Appeals it went up to the Court of Appeals, it went up to the Michigan Supreme Court, and we still don't have an answer. And so far it's been rejected. So we have to see. I mean, there has been other case law where this can be interpreted that gender would include sexual orientation. It should. But it certainly wasn't the intent of the legislature when they passed it, because they specifically excluded sexual orientation in this, and they did that for a reason, because they did not want to cover crimes that were based and targeted for sexual orientation. What is gender then? Sure, what is it? It's a good question. So it's traditional male and female. So if you have a man who, have you ever heard of incels? Anyone ever heard of incels? No? Okay. It's a specific group of men. It's kind of like they're called incels are short for involuntarily celibate, okay? And so it's a bunch of men who classify themselves as involuntarily celibate that hate women. And so there has been violence towards women from incel people. So that's what gender means, apparently. If you're a woman and the violence is directed to you because you're a woman. So, is what it is. So this is a 2-year felony. It takes a misdemeanor, like normal damage to property or a simple assault, and it makes it into a 2-year felony, or a fine of $5,000, sorry. It allows for a civil suit, so a person can sue a person for money damages for 3 times the amount of the damage, or $2,000. And it takes something, as I said before, that normally would be a misdemeanor, and it enhances it to a felony. So what can you do if you are the victim of a hate crime? So I always say report, report, report. If you know someone that has been the victim of a hate crime, not even you yourself, report, 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 even if you don't know it's a crime, because that's law enforcement's job to figure out whether it's a crime and actionable. But what's important about reporting is that when these incidents do occur and there is a chargeable offense and you get over all of the hurdles that are put in the way, you, as a prosecutor, you have to prove that the person did what they did because of their bias. And so other incidents of bias in the past become relevant to proving the current bias in the crime that's occurred. And so reports, when they're made, then they're generated and they're kept, become important later on down the road when the person starts escalating their behavior. So save all evidence, don't wash graffiti, even though that's probably the first knee-jerk reaction for what you would want to do to get rid of it. You would want to take photos of injuries or graffiti or objects or items that are left. You want to write down exactly what was said. You want to write down a description of the person, because the first question after you report to the police is, what did the person look like? And so when you're in that very shocked moment, you can forget those things. So I would say write it down and ask for a translator if needed. And tell police if there have been other incidents in the area or to the person. Tell police if the timing is important, whether it was a special holy day when it occurred, whether it was a special holiday. Of course, the police are going to know about communities in this area, but there's certain things that they might not know, like when is the end of Ramadan, or things that are culturally significant that are pretty detailed that they might not know. And what should you do if you're targeted? Obviously, if you're in immediate danger, you would always call 911 first, because your local police are your first responders, and they're the ones that are going to deal with the threat. If it's a physical threat, you would want to run, hide, and only fight as a last resort, and do not engage if you can help it. If it is a verbal threat, you want to call the police, write down the exact threat communicated, a description of the perpetrator, and note what direction they went. If it's an electronic threat, you want to make sure you're not deleting it, that you're printing it, or photographing it, and you want to contact law enforcement. If it's a written or a visual threat, you handle it as little as possible. Again, contact law enforcement, and you want to note the date, time, and location. So these are generally law enforcement approved from various police officers and chiefs that I've talked about. But I mean, bottom line is you always want to call 911 and you want to get out of the situation. That's the thing you want to do immediately first. And so there's always a question of what if the discrimination that's been experienced is not a crime? So the Michigan Department of Civil Rights has investigators for discrimination in housing. Someone won't rent to you because of your ethnicity, employment, education, public accommodation. That's like retail stores. You walk into a retail store and someone won't serve you, that sort of thing. You would contact the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, and the contact info is here. And so here's, generally, here's the numbers to call. So again, you call your local police if it's an immediate threat, but you can always follow up with us at the state, at the hate crimes unit, and our contact information is there. So I kind of, I know I'm kind of way early on time.
You've got about an hour.
Okay, so I can answer questions. If you have questions, I'm happy to do that. Or I've also got examples that I can give you of things where we can suss out together what you think about whether it's a hate crime or not. I think that helps me, at least when I'm trying to learn something new, is getting examples and then having to answer the questions, like a pop quiz. Think of it as a friendly pop quiz that you will not get berated if you answer wrong. Yes. Yeah. Sure. Cyberbullying is pretty specific, and the statute in Michigan was passed in the last couple of years. And what it does is it criminalizes conduct where someone posts something online with the intent to threaten somebody and harass somebody and intimidate somebody, and it does cause that. There's a specific statute, and I can pull it up, but essentially the difference between just like making a jerky comment on Facebook versus actually threatening somebody and intimidating them is pretty specific. But the difference is that cyberbullying intends to cause harm, and it does cause harm. So for instance, if you've heard of an example of someone who's several times, posting on Facebook, you should kill yourself, and then the person goes and kills themselves. That would be cyberbullying. That would be a pretty clear example of cyberbullying, right? Kim, did you have a question? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. And so The legislature at this point has not sought fit to change it, even though there's been pressure. There's been pressure for 20 years, and every attempt to include sexual orientation in that statute has been shot down and hasn't even gotten out of committee. So if there's something citizens can do, it would be pressuring their legislators. And we've made our attempts at trying to get the legislators to consider including that in the statute, but have failed. And there's always a group out there that is trying to amend the statute, right? They come up with new language, they come up with, you know, First Amendment protections and all sorts of things to amend that statute to make it better, because it's a pretty archaic statute. It's from the 1980s. And so there's always those efforts, but they never make it out of committee in the legislature. There's no will or desire for it, unfortunately. And now, with things getting as dicey, divided, the political rhetoric increases. It's like people go to their separate corners on each side and they dig in even harder, and then nothing gets done. You know what I mean? And there's no compromise. Now it's turned into, sexual orientation has turned into a religious liberty issue when it's not a religious liberty issue. And so it's a minefield, you know, and no one wants to touch it, you know, and legislators, I think, aren't gutsy enough to touch it sometimes.
I have a question.
Maybe that's probably political commentary I shouldn't be offering.
I have a question. I was thinking that disability or ability would be missing from that. You see someone who is obviously cognitively impaired or has some kind of, you know, there's a lot of invisible disabilities, but if you see something and so you go after them, you target them, that's not a hate crime?
No, I mean, it is a hate crime as a category. And so when we talk about what hate crimes are, that is included. But that specific statute, that Michigan statute, does not have disability. It should be written into the statute. That's been another push to include that in the statute, and that hasn't happened either.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. I don't have any handouts, I'm sorry. I don't. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
The Intimidation Act, I did see on there where it was saying, reporting a felony against somebody that maybe, you know, could be intimidation when you're reporting on somebody when it's not a felony. At least
False report of a felony?
false report.
Okay.
So, in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, two people, for example, in two different races or cultures. There's a part where somebody might feel intimidated just because of that law not to report, even though you're saying report, even if you don't know it's a crime. And the end result of a hate crime would be a felony. How does the Intimidation Act play with that? Would there be a slight fear of that person reporting in case it's not a felony, where they would, the counter would be, well, I'm going to come back at you with that intimidation. Did I get that out?
Yeah, so I think what you're confusing is that the Ethnic Intimidation Act only covers things that are assaultive and things that are damage to property and threats to do either one of those things. False report of a felony is a totally different law, and it has nothing to do with the identity of the victim. It's just falsely reporting a felony. Like, I call the police department, I call Chief Haynes right now, and I say, the building is on fire, and that's a false report of a felony, right? Or like, I saw my husband burn down a building when he didn't do that at all. That's false report of a felony. So this is where hate crimes get confusing, because they're a category of crime. So there is a way that if you're falsely reporting a felony, like for instance, the jogger in the park, the bird watcher in the park. Do you remember this in New York City? It was in the news some time ago. Yeah, well, African-American man, he's bird watching in the park, and this Caucasian lady is walking her dog, and she calls the police and says, this man is like being really aggressive with me. All he did was tell her to like put her dog on a leash, okay? And he is ready to assault me. That's false report of a felony. But it's motivated by bias, right? It's motivated by race, in whole or in part. So they're different crimes. Does that answer your question?
Somebody
Okay.
Wouldn't that person be able to come back with me on the flip side of the hate crime saying, well, because you're of a different race and you're blaming me and saying that there's a felony?
No, I mean, there's a difference between falsely reporting something that didn't occur and trying to give a lead to police. That's a different thing. Do you know what I mean? That's not falsely reporting a felony. You know what I mean? Like saying, there's this thing that happened and I think it's this person. It's trying to give a lead to the police. It's not falsely reporting a felony. Whether it's wrong or right.
Someone did send in, we had one question.
Oh, sure. Yeah. As commissioner on our city's Human Relations and Equity Commission and a Jewish person living in Madison Heights, I am concerned about the rise of incidents involving anti-Semitic hate speech. Anti-Israeli rallies have been promoted within Facebook groups within our city. During these rallies, Jewish Israeli flags are defaced, crowds chant for death to Israel, and carry signs calling Zionists Nazis. There has also been a rise of physical assaults on Jewish people across the country. Is the behavior these groups are doing considered free speech or hate speech? So, I mean, the answer is both. From what he's detailing in this question, it is free speech and it is hate speech. Hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. So you can say horrible things and carry horrible signs and be terrible to other people and call them terrible things, but that's not a crime, you know, unless there's an added component to that of, you know, I'm gonna physically assault you now, right? Or I'm gonna come and kick your ass, you know? I mean, there's ways that becomes a crime, but what this person is asking specifically is not a crime. It's hate speech and free speech all at the same time. And there has been a rise in physical assaults on the Jewish people across the country. Yes, that is true. There has been. We are seeing that. Jewish people are targeted often and horribly. Right now, I am dealing with, I have charged a case against the Base. Has anyone heard of the Base? It's a white supremacist terror cell in the United States that has cells all across the country, and the FBI has spent the last 2 years taking them down in various places, and they are a white supremacist paramilitary training gang that does firearms paramilitary training for the coming race war that is allegedly going to occur. And they target Jewish people, they target anyone that's not white. And so we have several cases on various members of that gang throughout the state and have classified them as a gang. So yes, that is definitely happening.
His wife was actually called a Nazi on Facebook.
Whose wife? Oh. And so calling someone a Nazi, unfortunately, is free speech.
I get it, and I get that. When you're living at age, I clean that up. I didn't want to say, you know, the nasty word, living in the. So anyway, how can it not be stopped? That's on Facebook, that's from everyone should see.
Yeah, I know, it's terrible, but we do have the First Amendment. And so if that's going to be stopped, then you can't regulate content on the other side, right? If you are on the other side and you're, I don't know, it's hard. I don't want to like sit here and start, you know, saying racial epithets here, but I mean, it's very difficult, and that's what our free speech allows us to do. It's the First Amendment. It's the Constitution, you know. And there's very specific categories of what is not protected by free speech. Like, for instance, child pornography is not protected by free speech, right? But pornography is. For instance, you know, saying hateful things is protected by First Amendment free speech, but acting on those hateful things is not, right? So there is no way to stop that. Everyone can call everyone else a Nazi all day long, and it's not something that local law enforcement or state or federal law enforcement can really stop. You could get off Facebook. I think that would solve a lot of the world's problems, unfortunately. Yes, ma'am.
I've tried to give them advice.
So I'm confused on how to prove intent when it seems to me, just break it down for me as plainly as possible.
Yeah.
It seems to me the way it's coming across is it's like you're reading someone's mind. At what point, because it doesn't become a hate crime?
Yeah. So here's the thing. crimes happen all the time where we have to prove intent, right? So for instance, first degree premeditated murder, right, happens. And prosecutors have to go into court and we have to prove intent all the time. We have to show that they intended to target that person, that they premeditated it, right? These are all things you would think normally, like, oh, well, that's in somebody's brain. People do things as a result of the things they think. So what we say when we get into court, when we prove any crime, whether it's assault with intent to do great bodily harm, assault with intent to murder, assault, just regular assault, we have to distinguish what people's intent is all the time. And how do we do that? We do that by what a person says, what a person does at the time of the crime, before the crime, after the crime, what they do, what they say, how they act, or any other facts and circumstances in evidence. So what does that mean? Is that if I see in a crime somebody's murdered, I go and I look at all the places they went ahead of the murder, right? I go and I look at, they went to the hardware store and bought rope. They went to the cleaning store, they went to Target and bought cleaning agents. They went to a gun shop and they bought a firearm. And they did that all right before they went over to this person's house and they used those things to commit the murder. Well, what's their intent? I have to prove that the person premeditated or thought about it beforehand, but that the crime occurred because of the perpetrator's desire to target somebody. So I'll give you one more example that might help here, is when, oh gosh, I lost my train of thought. Hold on. What was I just saying? When, hold on. So I was talking about premeditation and intent, and I was talking about, I'm sorry? Proving intent, and I was talking about hate crimes cases and how difficult they are to prove because of the intent. I'm sorry, just completely, totally blanked. I apologize.
Come back to it.
I'm the worst. It'll come back. It'll
We
come
understand.
back. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I just remembered it. Is that okay? Okay, all right. So what's crazy about hate crimes is that it's the only crime, ethnic intimidation, where you have to prove a motive, okay? So what's amazing about the law is that I don't actually have to prove a motive on any case, right? Jury, they want to know, why did the person commit the crime? Everybody wants to know, but I don't actually have to prove it in court. So I can walk in and just be like, this guy shot this guy and killed him, and that's it. And if I can prove that this guy shot this guy, I've proven my case. I don't have to tell you one iota why. And it,
But at the same time, educating those that might have to document, it's good to document things if you know things are going to be happening, even though a crime hasn't been committed, where if you're feeling a threat from a certain person over and over again, how do you educate people, look, because that intent to prove or prove that motive, to have that in the document, their history or that evidence of, look, they've been doing this. How do you educate the community, the public, or those people that might feel that way or feel they might be getting these documents, and how do you educate people should be taking records of that without creating that alarmist or triggered or, look what's happening in the city, look what we have to do. Because oftentimes that happens in different places, and where all of a sudden everybody's an alarmist, and we don't want to have that. But I think it's important that we educate those that might need or might not realize that they should be documenting some things. How do we express that out to our community without creating that atmosphere?
I'm not sure. I think we try to listen to each other. I mean, it's as simple as that. You're welcome. Yes, ma'am. Kim Clark. Councilwoman Clark. how do you improve the current statute? You get it changed. You get it changed, and I don't have an answer on how to do that except for the legislature to do that and follow the legislative process. Yeah, I'm sorry. I wish I had a better answer for you. Thanks. Yes, ma'am. Sure. Mm-hmm. 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 Well, I'm not sure I know of any hate crime hoax that's caused a city to burn.
No, there really
But are there?
racial tensions. When
Sure, racial tensions can be caused, for sure. Divide can happen.
you report a crime that didn't happen,
Yeah,
and it ends up being a hoax,
sure.
it's seeing that there are, this was committed against this minority.
Sure, but
It flares racial tensions, and yes,
there are close to 7,000 to 8,000 reports, and if you hear about a few where they are in fact hoaxes, I would say that that's probably commensurate to the number of crimes that are reported that are hoaxes as well, just general crimes. So I think it's probably commensurate. But after hearing me talk today and me not telling you anything about how Madison Heights is filled with hate crimes, how do you feel about the subject matter that I've talked about in this kind of arena? I mean, I don't think I'm stoking any racial divide.
my initial reaction when I read that article
Uh-huh.
was, wow, the assistant AG for the state of Michigan is showing up
Mm-hmm.
in my city.
Mm-hmm.
And it made me concerned because
Sure.
I'm like, is my city that out of control? Should I be moving?
Sure,
You
but,
know what I mean?
and I get it. Here's the thing about media reports.
Solution in search of a problem?
Yeah, I'd like to address that. Can I address
Yeah,
that? Okay.
please.
So, yeah, well, I apologize if it made you concerned. Yeah, no, I want to address that. So, and the chief just ran out, so can't ask him. But it's my understanding that we do not. It's my understanding that we do not have I'd say disproportionate. I don't know if that's the right term, but
To me, it seems like lately, all the people I have encountered, everyone just seems so loving towards each other. I'm serious, more than I've ever noticed before. So
right. So what has happened is across the country, we've seen, not here, but across the country. And there's been a lot of confusion, and I know there have been some concerns, and my concern is not that we have something here. My concern is I want to make sure that we keep it out. It's like anything else that happens.
There's already a law in place in Michigan against intimidation. So what more can we do?
Educate. So this was educational.
Did you learn anything? Did you learn anything?
That probably puts you in the maybe 1% of people who did, because most of us do not. It's like anything else. It's education, and I know that I don't know everything. And when I have a conversation with someone, I love school, I love going to classes, I love training, and I come out of it and I've learned something. And so this, for me, was I've had people ask me a lot of different questions, a lot of different things that are basically First Amendment rights. And I've had to explain, I've talked to a ton of different legal people about First Amendment rights and what you can and cannot do. And there are a lot of people out there who don't know a lot of these things. And so I called the Attorney General's office, we had a conversation, and again, as my understanding, there's racism everywhere. It's just one of those things, unfortunately, but I don't think we're not disproportionately higher than anywhere else. And it's just a matter of educating so that people know, because people will say such and such happened, that's racism. I'm like, I don't think it is. Or maybe it is, or I don't know. Or such and such happened, it's a hate crime. I don't know if it's a hate crime. So I thought, let me see if we can get an expert to come and talk to us. So that's what that was about.
I just think that lately, everything's so many things are viewed through the prism of race. I think it's like almost like the boy and black wolf. When it's overplayed so often, everything's viewed through that racism. It dilutes it when it really happens. Because everything now is used to, that's why I think everyone's getting along much better in my encounters with people. Because they're so over the whole thing with they're saturated with it. And it's making them, their heart grow bigger and they're nicer towards each other. Because they're just saturated with everything being viewed through that. Everything these days, it's too much. It's just too much.
That's unfortunate that you have that perspective.
Because everything is racist. And when things really do happen, it dilutes it. Because it's like the boy who cried wolf.
Well, I hope that you've learned something from me being here today.
So, the good thing you said, that I really just wrote down was that, it should be difficult. Like, nothing you showed up on the screen was a crime until there was a crime,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You prove it, you did it.
That's generally how it
you
works.
didn't do it, right? But it was in addition to something that stuck out to me when you said, was to stop a bigger message or a bigger effort, right? Is it bigger message public perceives, or is it the bigger message that was intended by the perpetrator? That you would look at that as
You can-
someone.
You can be a perpetrator and not desire to give a message to the entire community, but the community still feels it as an entire message, as if it was directed at them,
For example, and I'm sure it's difficult, but women get targeted because they're women. With
Yes.
that being said, don't see a lot of opportunity crimes attached with hate crime language. Somebody was selected as a woman because it's a crime of opportunity. They're a person of opportunity. Why aren't some of those crimes of opportunity charged that way?
Well, you have to have real clear evidence that the
Right.
reason they targeted the person is because of that, right?
Right.
So I'm glad you learned something.
Oh, that's good.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to bring this up since we're talking about this. So I also think that we all need to remember that we come with our own experiences. Some people might want to say bias, some people want to say wisdom. Because for me, as being a gay person, I know of at least more than a handful, more than 10, probably 15, 20 people in the last 20 years that have been affected by a hate crime for being gay. And probably
I have three murder hate crimes against individuals who are gay who were targeted because they were gay. I have 3 right now.
A lot of times in my community, at least the gay community, I've known that many that were afraid to even prosecute because of the crime itself and how it mentally affected them. They were even afraid. Just if you think of, for example, a lot of rape victims. How many women are afraid to stand up for themselves and say, this man did this to me? Same thing when you go to race, culture, creed, or hate crimes. You're going to have a large percentage that need to be convinced and pushed forward to report it. So it does exist out there more than we see. We need just to be aware of it, and when it does happen, or if we see one of our neighbors it does happen, then we need to encourage them to report.
Yes, ma'am.
My brother was almost murdered because he's gay outside of bar. So I look at this very personally. However, what I'd like to try to express is assault is assault is assault. So somebody committing that crime, first and foremost, should be charged with that. Then we go to the emotion of the hate crime and all of that. Am I correct in how that's how you work this out?
Well, I mean, like,
I mean, are you combining
so
hate crime with assault?
hate crime is a
Breaking down the law in little bits? Or
hate crime is
combined?
hate crime is a category. So like I explained before, even murder can be a hate crime. It's a category of crime, right?
Which is confusing to me. So
Sure.
I'm just trying to ask how you define that further.
Right. So if it's a category of crime, anything that falls under that category, so like a murder or a robbery or an ethnic intimidation, all of that can be classified as a hate crime, but it doesn't get treated any differently other than there's special resources dedicated to it. So murder is still murder. You still are going to get life, offense, you're still going to be charged with a life offense, whether it's a hate crime or not. But because it's a hate crime, it could get special resources dedicated to it for the prosecution of that. That's all. Yes, sir.
Are there any, groups that have been classified as hate groups by the FBI or the state?
So the state and the federal authorities do not classify hate groups. We don't designate hate groups. There's a lot of nonprofit organizations out there that designate hate groups. And so you could look online and type in hate groups Michigan.
Or maybe not hate groups, but you mentioned the base.
Sure.
I've never heard of that. Are there groups like
That's a domestic terrorism group. That's
domestic terrorist groups
in the city of Madison Heights that I am aware of or that I have cases on. No, I don't have cases in Madison Heights that are domestic terrorism related. But I do have domestic terrorism cases. For instance, the case with the state defendants that plotted to kidnap the governor. That's my case. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, have you ever heard of any crime against a straight white person?
I have heard of crimes against straight white people.
Because I'm told, and I'm not asking to be a smart man, but I'm told you can't have a hate crime against a white person.
That's not accurate. If there's a crime against you because you're white, that's a hate crime. If you're a crime against you because you're Protestant, that's a hate crime. I mean, if it's for your religion, it doesn't matter what the religion is, it doesn't matter what the race is. It can still be a hate crime if it's motivated by race.
Mine would be my mom. I don't know.
Yes, ma'am.
Following up on her statement, something came to mind, and that's this new critical race theory that's being taught in our schools. That's not going to be a project against white people.
Oh, that's an interesting view, ma'am. That's a very interesting view. Does anyone have a question related to what I'm actually presenting about? Anyone? Nobody? Okay.
Okay, it looks like there's no other questions. I want to thank everybody for coming out this evening and for everyone who's asked the questions. And Sunita, thank you so much